Approaching girls is very difficult, but for the same reason and the same underlying psychology behind why it's so difficult, if you can manage to get through the difficulty and actually do it, then it's something that can completely transform your life. Just to illustrate how hard it actually is and the kind of psychological forces involved, I want to start this off with a pretty crazy story that happened when I first started approaching girls. This happened about 10 years ago in 2014 when I was living in China. The way I had my life set up at the time was that I used to work alone in the forest at a remote fire tower for half of each year and then travel to China for the other half. That was sort of my life for a number of years, and it's where I originally learned how to approach girls and get a lot of experience dating and everything else. So on this particular trip, I was living in a city in southwest China called Kunming, and one day I got a phone call from my friend and she sounded very panicked and afraid, and she asked me where I was. I told her I was walking on the street, and she told me to get inside now. There's murderers on the loose killing people. Basically what happened was that there was a terrorist massacre at the train station where 8 people dressed up in black showed up with machetes and went on a killing rampage. They killed 31 people and wounded 143 others. This happened pretty close to where I lived, maybe like a kilometer away. I actually met a couple of girls that day who took a train and arrived just a little while after that happened, and they told me about the aftermath of mayhem and police and blood and everyone in terror. So it was pretty crazy. When this happened, the police shot and killed some of the terrorists, but some of them were still on the loose somewhere in the city. A couple nights later, I was actually run down on the street by 3 policemen. I guess in the dim light of the evening, they saw a guy with a beard, which is kind of what they were looking for, because apparently the killers were from the northwest part of China, which is a Central Asian ethnicity. But after they stopped me, one of them asked me where I was from, and I said Canada, and then they just said, "Oh, it's a foreigner," and just let me go. But even the police seemed very nervous. The first guy who stopped me was kind of shaking a little bit, and his voice was kind of shaking when he talked to me, so there was a lot of nervous tension in the air. So all of this craziness was going on in the background at that time, and I'll get back to this in a second, but first about approaching girls. Basically, leading up to this trip, I had gone through a bunch of different things, including breaking up with my girlfriend, and I'm not going to get into all the details right now, but basically for a number of reasons, I decided to start approaching girls. So I learned a bunch of different stuff in the months leading up to the trip, and it was what I was going to devote this particular trip to doing. But when I actually arrived in China, I quickly realized that my original plan to start going to bars and clubs wasn't a very good idea at all, because the bar scene in China is not really the best place to find hot girls. Usually the hot girls in China, when it comes to partying, they more stick to their own friends and go to like private karaoke's and stuff like that. And I don't even like going to bars in the first place, but when I tried to do it just to meet girls, there were basically no real opportunities, at least in the places where I went. But then I noticed that if you just walk around on the streets, about every 10 minutes or so, you'll walk past a very attractive girl, the type who would be like the hottest girl at any given bar or club. So I realized that what I really needed to do was learn how to approach girls on the streets. But this is easier said than done, and I didn't really know how to do it. So I did some research, and eventually I found what I believe is the best way to approach, which is called a Yad approach, named after the guy who invented it. Basically, you jog up to the girl from behind and circle around her and come in front of her and ease her to a stop. This is what I still do 95% of the time when I approach girls to this day. It's the best way to meet hot girls because you'll find them most often just walking from one place to another. But the problem is that this is extremely difficult to do when there's a bunch of people around and everyone can see if you get rejected in broad daylight. Especially in the beginning, if you've never done it before, it can be very terrifying. So what ended up happening was that for several months, I was walking around on the streets for literally hours every day with the intention of doing it, but I just couldn't get through the barrier of fear and actually do it. But meanwhile, my trip wasn't just completely wasted because I still managed to start approaching girls at a hostel that I used to hang out at. This was my second year living in that same city, so I had already built up a social circle and I knew most of the people working at that hostel. So the previous year, I used to just hang out there there and play pool all the time, and I would actually meet girls naturally by just hanging out there. So I wasn't just starting approaching as a complete beginner with girls. Like, I already had years of different experiences leading up to this, but now I was expanding on everything that I had built up before that by going out of my way to go sit down at tables with different girls and say hello and start talking to them. And this was also difficult to do, but to me, this was not exactly pure approaching, because I was in an environment where I already knew people and had social proof. So it was kind of like a hybrid of social circle and approaching, where I was basically expanding on my social circle by going and approaching girls in the same environment. But this was still a step forward for me, and by doing this, I did have some success, and I slept with a couple of girls who were hotter than anyone I had ever been with before. And there were also a bunch of other girls I went on dates with and stuff like that. But in general, there were very limited options at that hostel. Maybe in one day, there would be like 2 or 3 girls that I could approach. And meanwhile, the kind of girls I would see just walking around on the streets all the time were of a much higher caliber than the kind of girls who would sporadically appear at the hostel. So I never lost sight of the fact that I had to start approaching girls on the streets. But the months went on, and I still couldn't do it until I hit the point where I was almost reaching the end of my trip. And I didn't want to fail and not be able to do it at all, and then have to wait another half year to try it again on my next trip. So I made a plan and decided to travel to another city for 10 days just to change the location and also get away from that hostel, which was kind of like a safety net for me. So I wanted to go to a new place where I didn't know anyone and I could completely focus on one thing, which was approaching girls on the streets. So I booked a plane ticket and went to a city called Chengdu. And my plan actually worked out, and I did manage to start approaching on the streets. Basically, all I was doing was going around and approaching a bunch of different girls and telling them that I think that they're cute and then saying goodbye, just to get through the barrier of fear and start actually approaching and setting up the foundations for my next trip where I could expand on this. This might not seem all that crazy, just stopping random girls and giving them compliments, but at the time, this was absolutely amazing, and it was a life-changing experience. And I'll get back to that in a second, but this is where that terrorist attack comes back into play, which happened just a couple of weeks before I went to this new city. And even though I was in a different city, you could still feel a lot of nervous tension in the air. And there was a lot of police and military presence and stuff like that. And for example, I remember one time I was at a metro station where you could look into it from the street above, and I was just standing there looking down, and then suddenly someone made kind of a jerking movement which triggered the people around him to jump up and almost start running away, until a couple seconds later they realized that nothing was happening and they all just sort of calmed down and sat back down. So this is the kind of tension that was in the air. Like, underneath the surface, everyone was sort of on edge. And then one day I was walking along the streets and suddenly I heard screaming and terror, with literally thousands of people running and screaming down the streets towards me, yelling out, "They're killing people." So when I saw this, I turned around and started running with them, with images of death flashing through my mind, and I assumed there was some sort of massacre going on. But after I ran for about a block, I stopped and looked back and just kind of waited. And after a few minutes, the stampede calmed down, but then a couple minutes later, another stampede came with people running and screaming in terror again. But I just stayed there and continued to stand and watch as another and another and another stampede came flooding down the streets, like wave after wave. At one point, I saw an entire building of people spewing out onto the streets. And it happened a few times when people who were running by looked over at me, and then they suddenly looked completely terrified. They probably thought that maybe I was one of the killers. So basically, it was just a completely insane situation. And I'll get back to how this all relates to approaching girls in a second, but later on, after this was all finished, I went back to the hostel that I was staying at, and I asked them if they knew what happened, and they told me it was some sort of practical joke where someone started screaming murder, which started a chain reaction of stampedes. By the way, a few years after this happened, I started posting on a Chinese social media app that's kind of like TikTok, and I ended up getting a bunch of viral videos, and I built up a following of 20,000 followers. And one time I made a video and talked about this story, but then there were a bunch of comments on that video where people didn't believe that this actually happened. So I tried to find some news article or some video or something so I could just reply to their comments and give them a link to show them. But it turns out that this story was totally censored. I assume to prevent this kind of panic from spreading, because this kind of stampede in and of itself is very dangerous. The only thing that I could find was one video on the Chinese version of YouTube, which was probably on the very outskirts of what happened, that showed like 20 people running by. And the title of the video was something like tens of people running away in terror. So it totally downplayed what happened. Now I can't even find that video, but I did manage to find a video on YouTube from a channel called China Forbidden News. It turns out that this same thing actually happened in 2 different cities at that time.
那么自从云南昆明火车站发生301血案以来，中国大陆的社会安全问题就成了海内外关注的焦点。而在中国大陆民间，则是出现了大范围的恐慌及焦虑情绪，甚至达到了闻侃而色变的程度。近期更是接连在2个城市上演了一人炸喊、有人砍人、千人惊恐夺路狂奔的闹剧。
广州沙河大街某服装批发市场保安抓获一名小偷，为了能顺利逃走，这名小偷突然大喊一声“有人砍人”，引发周围数千商户和顾客闻讯四散逃跑。无独有偶，四川成都也发生了类似由砍人引发的群体狂奔。据大陆媒体报道，3月14号下午，成都市区人群密集区春熙路忽然出现了数百人在大道惊恐奔跑的景象。后来经过证实，当地警方承认是有人谣传有人砍人导致。
So how does this whole situation relate to approaching girls? Well, when I got to that place that I mentioned where I stopped and waited as wave after wave of stampedes ran by, there were also a few other people like me who stopped in the same area and were just standing and watching and waiting. And I noticed that one of these people was a girl who I had seen about an hour before that, who I was going to approach, but I was too afraid and I hesitated too long, and then she disappeared into a crowded marketplace. So I just moved on and never actually approached her. So now that I saw her again, I decided maybe I'll go and talk to her and ask her if she knows what's going on. So I went up and approached her and asked her that, and she looked at me and she didn't say anything. She just looked at me for a few seconds and then sharply turned her head away from me, like totally shunned and rejected me. And this rejection shut me down. It affected me emotionally way more, like orders of magnitude more, than the crazy scenario that was going on around me, which at the time I literally thought was because of some sort of terrorist massacre going on just blocks away from me. So to me, this goes to show the extreme power of the psychological forces involved when it comes to approaching girls, and why it's so difficult. Because this wave after wave of stampedes of thousands of people running in terror was one of the craziest things that I've ever seen, at least in terms of the massive amount of collective fear and panic. I was even in Ukraine when the war started, and there was nothing even close to this level of panic when that happened. There was actually no sense of panic whatsoever. For example, the first day of the war, I was waiting all day at the train station in Kiev to get on a train and start making my way out of the country, and everyone there was just totally calm, as if it was just another day and nothing was happening. And I got to another city, Lviv, the next day, and there were times when I was walking on the streets with missile sirens going off, but everyone just continued walking around as if everything was normal. I'm sure everyone was afraid and going through all sorts of crazy emotions on the inside, but you couldn't tell just by looking at people or by the overall atmosphere. So even compared to being in a literal war zone, the situation I witnessed in Chengdu was way more crazy, just in terms of the intensity of the reaction and the complete panic, which made it feel as though something absolutely insane and life-threatening was happening. But then then this little rejection from some girl I didn't even know completely took me over, so that all the stampedes and what I thought was a possible terrorist massacre no longer even felt very important or significant in comparison, at least in my own subjective feeling that I experienced in the moment. It was totally eclipsed by the feeling of rejection. This is the power of the psychology involved in approaching girls, and it's at the root of what needs to be overcome in order to actually do it. It's basically this fear of rejection which creates so much anxiety and prevents you from being able to do it. And I don't want to make it sound too difficult, because despite this, I still managed to start doing it, and it is possible for anyone to do. But I think it's important to understand the underlying psychological forces involved. Basically, on a deep unconscious level, the fear of approaching is literally the fear of death. Because as humans, we are a social animal, so we've organized ourselves into groups and societies. So when it comes to basic animal survival instincts, like getting attacked and killed by wild animals, or even this kind of terrorist situation that I was just talking about, in general, the society protects us from these kinds of threats. So now our relationship with society itself takes on the more important psychological role, where it can either give us this protection, or the society can be turned against us and even has the power to completely destroy our lives or our entire existence. And when you face a girl, you're not just facing her, but what you unconsciously perceive to be her entire social world and her place within society as a whole, including other potential alpha males who might also be interested in her. So basically, on a deep instinctive level, there's a fear that if you approach her, this potential crowd of people or these other alpha males might retaliate against you and either attack and kill you or exile you from society and leave you to die alone. And even in modern times, where we can logically understand that if you approach a girl, you're probably not going to die, but there are still things like cancel culture where you can get your reputation destroyed or lose your job. So there's still this kind of instinctive fear of basically getting shunned and rejected and outcast from society. And the hotter the girl, the more powerful echelons of society she represents to our unconscious mind. So the more powerfully we feel the kind of pressure and fear that makes it so difficult to approach her. But if you're able to overcome this, then that means you have within yourself the ability to basically overpower these psychological forces which would otherwise continue to constrain you. And this has massive implications and can even completely change your life. Because the truth is that even though there can be this massive fear involved, if you go and approach a girl, nothing bad is probably ever going to happen to you beyond just getting rejected, which in and of itself is actually a good thing because it will make you stronger over time. And if you can get through the barrier of fear, then you will see this directly, like you make it through to the other side and survive. And it's almost like you enter into a new reality that lies on the other side of the barrier of fear. Just to give an example, I'm sure you've experienced this before, where you see an attractive girl and she looks very intimidating. Like if you imagine talking to her, it feels like she would just be annoyed and angry and reject you. But then if you actually go and approach her, and if it's a good approach, then she'll be smiling and happy that you came and talked to her. So there's this difference between what you imagine will be the outcome based on your worst fears versus the actual reality that you experience directly. And this is like a metaphor for what happens on a much deeper level, where there's this instinctive fear of death or having your reputation destroyed or whatever. But then when you actually do it, you see that this was all just a psychological illusion, and your mind was basically just tricking you into believing that this was true in order to prevent you from doing it. So by approaching girls, you cut through this kind of psychological illusion and enter into a new reality. And this can feel amazing. Like when I was in Chengdu, in the story that I just talked about, and I finally started approaching girls on the streets after months of failing to do it, it was one of the most amazing feelings that I've ever had. And when I think back to that time, it's like this epic moment in my life. I still remember just walking around on the streets and that feeling of finally breaking free. It was so awesome, and it made me feel more alive, and it made everything around me feel more alive. And there truly is a psychological transformation that happens, where once you pass through the barrier of fear, your mind has to basically map out a new reality that lies on the other side side of that barrier. For example, I remember after the first day of approaching girls on the streets, I was laying in bed at night and I couldn't sleep. My mind was just racing with images of walking on the streets and people and talking to girls, and I could literally feel my brain rewiring. It's like by approaching girls and breaking through this barrier of fear on a deep psychological level, you're actually breaking free from the confines of your current world. And when you do this, your mind opens up to see the world completely differently. But one thing that I've noticed is that when you go through this kind of transformation or anything similar to this, where you're basically leveling up and breaking through into a new world, a lot of the time it can happen that your current world will basically descend into chaos for a certain amount of time. Kind of like my example where I finally started approaching girls and then there was a crazy stampede and just total chaos manifested in the world around me. Like, I don't think it's just a crazy coincidence that I just so happened to be at that exact place and time when this happened, while I also just so happened to be in the process of breaking through massive psychological barriers and going through this crazy life-changing experience. You know, it's kind of like with this YouTube channel and the business that I started a few years ago. Basically, the way that I started this was I spent 2 years taking everything that I've learned about building confidence and getting good with girls and all this kind of stuff that has completely transformed my life over the course of about a decade and made it into a step-by-step system of training, which is my self-mastery course. This took me way longer and it was way more work than I ever expected going into it. But once I finally finished, I bought a plane ticket to Europe, and my plan was to launch my business and go traveling around Europe for a couple of years at the same time as I started working on the actual business side of things. And just like with approaching girls, this was a scary thing for me to do. But my plane ticket was in April of 2020, right when the whole world descended into chaos with lockdowns, and my plane ticket was canceled. So I ended up getting on one of the first planes out of Canada after flights started up again that summer. And first I went to Prague, which was one of the only places open that I could get into at the time. And then I went to Ukraine and ended up living there for over a year, where again, I just so happened to end up in the place that further descended into chaos with war. And you might not experience anything quite this crazy, but the point is that you can expect some sort of chaos in your life when you cross the barriers of fear and go through some sort of life-changing journey. But it's important to understand that this kind of chaos never lasts forever. At some point, your inner and outer world will reconsolidate and reform into something more stable in a way where you are stronger than you were before. It's kind of like there was one period in my life when I lived at a temple in China, and I would get up every morning at 5 a.m. for pretty intense, hardcore training. If you've ever seen Kill Bill Volume 2, where she goes to the temple and trains with the master, it was kind of like that. Like, it felt like I was in a movie the whole time. But for the first couple weeks, I felt totally destroyed. Like, my whole body on the inside just felt completely exhausted and worn down. And I just felt like a mess internally. But then over the course of the next few weeks, everything inside of me reformed into something stronger than before. It's kind of like when a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, where it makes a cocoon and then dissolves itself into a kind of mush and then slowly reforms into the form of a butterfly. That's what it felt like. Like, my skin was the cocoon and everything inside of me was just mush. And then I reformed and restructured into a stronger version, both physically and mentally, than I was before. So it's this same kind of thing that can also happen with the external world around you, which is like a reflection of your inner self. I've personally seen so many strange things in my life that I can only come to the conclusion that life is basically like a dream. You may or may not agree with this, but it is true that you can expect to go through some sort of crazy experiences if you're really serious about facing fears and making big changes in your life. But in the end, at the center of all the outer chaos is where the inner transformation takes place. A good metaphor is if we go back to my story about the stampedes in China. When I was standing in that place where I got rejected by that girl, and I was just kind of waiting and wondering what was going on, the temptation entered my mind to go and see for myself and find out what was causing this insanity. So after a little while, the stampedes started to calm down, and there was still fear, but I started to walk into the fear and walk in the direction where all the stampedes were coming from. So I made my way back to the main pedestrian shopping area in the city center, and what did I find when I got there? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Everything was just completely calm and actually a lot more peaceful than usual because the streets were way more empty than they ever usually were. So at the center of all the chaos was just peace, kind of like the eye of a hurricane. This is actually similar to what can happen when you approach girls, where leading up to it, you can be afraid of what all the surrounding people are going to think and what kind of reaction she might have and whatever other crazy fears might be going on in your mind. But then when you cut through all that and approach her, it all completely disappears and it's just you and her talking to each other. And it's the same with all of life. At the center of all the chaos is you.